Okay, thank you everyone, especially for coming in on such a nice day. Sorry we can't do this outside, but you wouldn't be able to hear us. We're here to spend a little over 2 hours with a group of experts talking about security, political, economic issues in the U.S.-China relationship at a critical time in the history of our bilateral relations. I'm Michael Green. I'm professor here in School of Foreign Service in Asian Studies and also at CSIS. I'll be moderating our panel of experts and introducing some of our speakers. But let me first invite Jianmin Ren, who is the president of the Georgetown University China Student and Scholars Association, which has existed since well before I came to Georgetown in 2006. I think it's almost 2 decades old, but it has just blossomed in the last year or two to Jianmin's enormous credit. And this kind of conference is a great opportunity for students, faculty, journalists, and policymakers alike. For those of you who don't know her, she's a second-year MA student in the Public Policy School here at Georgetown in the master's program, and runs the association here. From Shanxi, and graduate of the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. So she's going to have some opening remarks, and then I'll introduce you to our first speaker.
Thank you, Professor Green. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to come to Georgetown for this special event. My name is Jianmin Ren. I'm a second-year public policy student at Georgetown and the president of Chinese Students and Scholars Association. I am so proud to be a member of GUCSSA, which provides opportunities for me not only to exchange ideas with other American and Chinese students, but also help me to learn how to make efforts to promote the U.S.-China relations. As one of the biggest international student groups in Georgetown, GUCSSA aims to promote the exchange of ideas and dialogue within the association and the broader Georgetown University community. Inspired by our mission, I have, along with our broad committee members, dedicated countless hours and efforts to organize the Georgetown's first China-U.S. forum. So I would like to thank my committee members first. Thank you for your dedication and hard working, which made today's event possible. I would also like to thank our co-sponsor, the Asian Studies program in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Jennifer Moore and Kat Harrington, thank you so much for all your help and support. Please also allow me to thank our other sponsors, the Georgetown Graduate School Organization and the Lecture Fund of Georgetown University. I was in a meeting last year, and one phrase mentioned by a speaker really impressed me. He said, "Think small first, but aim big." Our forum today is the first at Georgetown, but not the last. The goal of our forum is to provide a unique platform for policymakers, business leaders, students, and scholars to discuss the current issues on the U.S.-China relations in the areas of economic, political, and cultural cooperation. We aim to host this forum as an annual event at Georgetown University and to promote the communication and career opportunities for students. And we are so lucky to have so many distinguished speakers here today with us. And I sincerely thank you all for being here. Thank you.
So to provide a scene setter for the panel discussion and pose some hard questions, which as moderator I will try to get the panel to answer, we're pleased to have Albert Keidel, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and teaches here at Georgetown in the Public Policy Institute on the Chinese economy. Dr. Keidel joined the Treasury Department in 2001, the same year I joined the National Security Council staff working on East Asia. He was the leading China expert in Treasury and had responsibility for the rest of Asia. I was the leading Japan-Korea expert in NSC and eventually had responsibility for all of Asia. So we were able to work together, and the entire U.S. government sort of in these meetings would stop talking and listen carefully. which, believe me, didn't happen that often in the U.S. government, when Albert Keidel started talking about the Chinese economy. He's one of the countries in the world's leading experts. He's worked not only in Treasury, but in the World Bank office in Beijing. He speaks fluent Mandarin and studied China and Japanese in Japan as well. A graduate of Princeton with a Harvard PhD in economics. So for the next panel, this is a little bit like your dissertation committee. You're going to get all the hard questions now and some scene setters, and then we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And wow, one of my messages here is don't believe everything you hear. I'm very delighted to be here. I want to thank Jianmin for the invitation and congratulate you for all your hard work. This is really a wonderful first forum event, and I know there will be many that follow. And I'd also like to thank Professor Victor Cha and the Asian Studies program for being the formal sponsor of the forum. And I want to speak very hopefully today. This is a time of really swirling changes in East Asia and in China. And I want to encourage you as the audience, I'm going to speak mostly to the audience right now, to think independently. I hope we can watch out for sort of old assumptions, stale assertions, and including our own stale assertions. So keep me straight also. I think many familiar accounts are comfortable. They feel good. But do they fit the facts? That's what I'd like you to ask. They may be comfortable because they don't really challenge our inherited ways of thinking and the way that our countries think, our national beliefs. And I have been listening to psychologists and meetings, researchers who say that disagreement, openly discussed and argued, is probably the best kind of thinking. It's the best way to find out what works and what doesn't work, what is really perhaps true. So I'm hopeful today we can challenge one another, challenge ourselves, and I hope we can, just as importantly, accept challenges to what we think. Things that say, well, maybe you're wrong. There's no shame in being wrong. That's an important thing. Many of us have too much pride so that we hold on to our beliefs instead of saying, well, gosh, okay, I was wrong. I'm not infallible. Many of us want this aura, I've always been right, I always will be right. We need to throw that away and ask ourselves hard questions. You can even ask a question, should I ask questions? But I'll let you work on it. In the Western Pacific today, we have a time of change and opportunity. And we've seen a change in leadership teams in almost every major country in the region. And I'm hoping now that we can get past the political rhetoric of those change in leadership events. Politicians have to assume postures that are sometimes confrontational in the international arena. And let's leave that behind if we can. Let's try to engage in what's actually possible and happening right now. Let's just not carry over willy-nilly the events from last year into 2013. A second important background to our thinking, I think, should be two major events that have occurred in the last 5 years. One is the global financial crisis, in which the political and economic structures of the advanced countries failed and are still recovering only slowly. And second, China kind of sailed through the financial crisis with very little difficulty, breaking a lot of the rules of, let's say, economics, which I was taught in graduate school. So how did they do that? And are they cheaters? And maybe, in fact, they didn't do so well. Is China ready to collapse? These are some of the issues that we're now wondering about. And so these two recent developments, China's success and the failures of the economic and, to a certain degree, political systems of the West, should give us pause. How do we absorb all of this? Let me just throw out a few issues that I would invite for critical investigation. First, let's take China's economy. Take growth. Seems to have slowed last year to only 7.8%. Is China's period of high-speed growth really finished? What do we make of information that says the economy had actually turned around in the early summer of last year, in the second quarter? It turns out that if you look at the quarter-on-quarter economic data, sorry if you're not an economist, but this is the most accurate way to measure GDP growth. When data come out in a couple of weeks on the first quarter of this year, it's probably going to be about 8.5%. So is China coming back out to its traditional cyclical economic pattern, where it grows rapidly, slows down for inflation, and then grows rapidly again? Or is it ready to collapse? What about a real estate bubble? Could a real estate collapse crash the whole Chinese economy? Can we believe evidence that we've seen on television programs? I get so many messages from brokerage houses that so many Chinese hold property that's not occupied, the price is going to crash, they're going to be impoverished as a result, and the whole economy is going to come down. Most of the serious economists I talk to think that the air was let out of that bubble beginning about 2 years ago. And so why do we hear these scary stories? They come mostly, I've researched the experts that are used in a lot of these stories. They come from banks, brokerage houses, other kinds of financial institutions. Is it possible that global financial houses are promoting these stories to scare their clients into buying hedging instruments, financial instruments that might protect them? We need to keep an open eye. What are the facts? What's actually happened to those prices? And how great is the danger? What about the widespread view that China's economy is unbalanced, too dependent on exports and domestic investment? Doesn't China need to shift to domestic consumption? The odd thing is that real household consumption in China, this corrected for inflation, grew 10% last year. 10% growth. That's a very high growth rate. And more interestingly, it's done that for about 10 straight years on average. 10 years we've seen 10% growth in consumption. So you could say that China already has consumption-led growth. The question is then, what kind of investment does it take to sustain 10% growth in consumption? Well, if you do the math, we'd like to talk about capital requirements and investment requirements. It takes a share of investment in GDP of about 45% to maintain 10% consumption growth. So is China's investment share in GDP too high? It wouldn't seem so. We need to be very careful not to misinterpret a low share in GDP for consumption as weak consumption demand in China. In fact, the reverse is the fact. It takes that low share of consumption in GDP in order to sustain 10% growth in consumption. Well, how can this be? This is not what everyone says. Isn't a low share supposed to be a problem? Maybe not. What do you think? What about exports? Isn't China in trouble because its major trading partner, Europe, is back in recession again? And the United States growth is quite slow. Doesn't China have to make a dramatic shift away from export-led growth? Again, let's look at the facts. What do we make of the fact that China's growth over the last 10 years, actually you can go back 20 or 25, when it surges and when it goes more slowly, it's completely out of sync with the United States. Now granted, South Korea, Japan, the economy of Taiwan, Thailand, Germany. If the US goes down, they all slow down. If the US takes off, they all take off. Not China. China's cycles are real, but they follow domestic policies. So how vulnerable is China really to its exports in terms of generating growth? Exports are important. China sells a lot and then with it buys foreign technology and critical materials. But for the demand pulling the economy along, the evidence all shows that it's domestically generated, not reliant on exports. Now that's strange, you say. Hasn't China relied on a cheap currency to sell its exports so it can grow fast? Isn't China's undervalued currency the secret of its success? Well, not everyone agrees with that. What do we make of the IMF's, the International Monetary Fund's, own internal evaluation group's report about a month ago? This report criticized the IMF research department for emphasizing exchange rates so much at the request of the US government. Instead, the report said the research department should have focused on the increase in credit and liquidity generated by the U.S. financial liberalization. That the growth of global liquidity was a major factor in the imbalances that the world has seen. And there's been research on this for more than half a decade that implicates the United States in global imbalances because it has the largest deficit and the surpluses appear in other countries. But the important thing is go back, look at that report, ask yourself, what do you think? What do we make of China's new leadership team? Are they reformers? Many analysts say that Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao years were a lost decade, that they didn't continue the previous Premier Zhu Rongji's reforms. But people seem to mean different things by the word reforms. Many feel reforms have to mean sort of a dramatic dismantling of government participation in the economy, like the 1990 sale of state-owned enterprises, like the privatization of housing in China. But others stress that real reforms are the gradual implementation of difficult tasks, like urbanization, like the building of social safety nets, like rural modernization. These are very difficult to carry out. Land taxation reform, how to manage the land situation in China. China's new leadership seems to be following that second definition of reforms. There are some members who have been promoting dramatic changes, for example, in the financial sector, but they really weren't promoted to powerful positions in this new government. I'm thinking Zhou Xiaochuan, head of the central bank, and Lou Jiwei, who was put in as the head of the Ministry of Finance, which is a weak ministry. It's a great, comprehensive ministry, but it really is a fiscal ministry with some limited responsibilities. Instead, Ma Kai, who was once head of the Planning Commission, is now vice premier. And they've also promoted a not very well-known leader from the Land Ministry to run the State Planning Commission. Land management is going to be a very serious issue and a challenge, and the Chinese are going to work on that pretty hard in the coming 5 years. So what lessons do you think China's new leadership has drawn from the global financial collapse? What lessons should they have learned about financial liberalization? Ask yourself what you think. And on China's relations with the U.S., what about strategic mistrust? It's a very common phrase in the discussion in recent months, in the last year in particular. Is this mistrust just sort of a cautionary relationship, two countries eyeing each other warily? Or is mistrust strengthened by the self-interested incentives of certain members of either side of that party? That's clearly the case in the commercial world, where certain parties use mistrust to get advantages for themselves. But could it be a factor in the cyber world? Might mistrust encourage more resources to go into cyber warfare capabilities? If mistrust is an internally generated dimension to it, what's the role for real leadership in both countries? The role for real leadership in the United States and China. And what do we make of the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's recent suggestion that top U.S. and Chinese leaders work on some manageable projects as a way of building understanding? What about North Korea? Is there time for a new joint approach to North Korea now? I mean, what in the world is really going on in North Korea these days? When I was managing Treasury's department, Asia department, I had access to information about the domestic economic reforms in North Korea. They all ended when the Sunshine Policy ended with President Lee in South Korea. And it's interesting, if we think about North Korea, we look back to China's experience in the 1980s. There were some radical movements that seemed very crazy, anti-bourgeois liberalization campaigns, but they seemed after the fact to always precede what were dramatic initiatives in economic reforms. So those of you that have kids, many of you don't as students, but I have a 10-year-old girl, and what do you do when you're in a power struggle and you've got a temper tantrum? The expert research on longitudinal parental studies says if you're at that point, you're already lost. You need to back off. You need to establish a different relationship with your child where you have together agreed on some rules of the road. So that's what the responsible adult does in that situation. Could leadership in North Korea be building its political cushion for some economic reforms by taking extreme views in another direction? I don't know. What is the United States doing? Could it be strengthening the hardliners' position by the positions it's taking? What are we doing to give credibility to reformers in North Korea? Is there some way that Xi Jinping and President Obama can together come to an agreement of cooperation? Because China has shifted to not foreign aid for North Korea, but development assistance. So that there is potential here for dramatic change, but it really takes adult leadership on both sides. Okay, I see I've hit my mark on time. I hope we can have a lively, even confrontational forum, so get your questions ready and don't be shy. And remember, there are no bad questions, so strike out. And again, I would like to thank the GUCSSA for this opportunity, and I look forward very much to the proceedings.
Ladies and gentlemen. I have two little kids too, and I wish I'd had them before I had to negotiate with North Korea. I would have been better prepared. We're going to now invite a panel of experts to talk about security, political, and economic developments in China and in U.S.-China relations. GUCSSA has assembled a great panel to discuss this. And we'll go in the order you see here. First, Chang Lu, to my left, a colleague at CSIS, where he's the visiting fellow in the Freeman Chair in China Studies. He is associated with the Institute of American Studies in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, top think tank in Beijing and in China overall. Oriana Skylar Mastro, her business card says Fellow, the Center for New American Security. But beginning this summer, her business card will say Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro, Assistant Professor at Georgetown University. So she'll be joining the Security Studies program. She's fluent in Mandarin. She hasn't defended her dissertation yet. Every confidence that she'll go through with flying colors. She's fluent in Mandarin and is an Air Force lieutenant now in the reserves, and is the, I am told, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's go-to person. I've actually seen this happen where senior 2- and 3-star Air Force officers will defer to then second lieutenant and doctoral candidate Mastro. So she's an expert on security and in the Asia-Pacific region, and of course in U.S.-China relations. Derek Sitters, a friend, expert at the Heritage Foundation, where he's a senior research fellow focusing on Chinese economy, also Indian economy and Asian economies more generally. He has a master's from the University of Chicago in economics, which is almost like having a PhD in economics from anywhere else, and political economy PhD at Stanford. And finally, I'm meeting for the first time and looking forward to hearing from Lan Lanzhan, who is the Chief Executive Officer, China International Capital Corporation, U.S. Securities, Inc. She has a master's from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and studied at Shanghai University Institute for International Studies. So we have a mix of academics, military, economics, business. We have about 7 or 8 careers represented in 4 people, which is a good way to try to cover the waterfront on U.S.-China relations. We'll have comments on security and politics and economics, about 10 minutes from each speaker. I'll ask a question or two and get your questions ready, because then we'll open it up to you. So, with that, Mr. Lu, please.
Thank you, Mike, for your kind introduction. And my thanks also extend to the Georgetown University, the Association of Students and Scholars, for inviting me to be with such an extraordinary panelists. I want to give a speech, just a few points about my observations on what is going on in China and the U.S. So first of all, I want to give some comments on the politics in China, and then I'm going to speak a few words about the U.S.-China relations. So last year, that's 2012, actually was a very extraordinary year for China. All of us may have experienced something very special in China, centered with what happened in a city which was which had not drawn much attention in the period before that. That's Chongqing. Yeah, because of what happened in Chongqing, the worldwide media puts their attention on this city and what happens there. And in China, there was a kind of force want to derail the politics to explain what happens there in a political way, so that in my mind, to derail the politics in China. But and then everybody was expecting what will be the result in the 18th Party Congress. Okay, so here I read a lot in the U.S. media explaining what happened in the 18th Congress. Most people here would like to say that there emerged a conservative group of people, top people leading China now. But in my mind, it's not. Actually, the top 7 people, the top 7 emerged from the 18th Congress. In my mind, they are a group of people who are highly prudent and immensely experienced. Yeah, this is a very prudent leadership which can guarantee that the future development in China will not derail politically. So that's that gives me much confidence in the future of China. And now we see just last month we got a new cabinet, and we see a continuity of the government leadership, which is composed of a few of the people who are highly experienced technocrats, and we can see that most of them were getting to their positions very long ago, over 10 years ago, in the years of President Jiang Zemin and Zhu Ji. Yeah, so I'm confident in the current leadership, both of the party and the government. So now, what's the most important thing in the Chinese domestic policy? First of all, I just say that what I'm sensing is the forthcoming efforts of urbanization in China. I think the most important thing I read in the recent documents from both the party and the government is that China, in the coming years, China will make great efforts in urbanizing, in further urbanizing China. That means in the coming 10 years, 20%, some more 20% of the whole population, Chinese population, will be going to the cities. In the coming 10 years, 20% of the population is about some 300 million people. Yes, that's a great deal. That's a great deal. And the government will, I heard the government will spend some $8 trillion in investment for this efforts. So that's an important trend for Chinese, both politically and economically. And together with this 8 trillion investments, there will emerge a great thing in China. That's the bond market, the government bond market, because China will not rely solely on the government investment, but they will create a very large, maybe the largest bond market in the world to support the efforts of the urbanization. And what it means for this urbanization efforts, I think this means that China, the growth of Chinese economy will be based more on the domestic demand, and less dependent on the overseas market in the mid and long term. In the coming 5 or 10 years, we will see clearly that trends. The Chinese economy will be much less dependent on the overseas market, and what it further means that the huge trade surplus of China's now enjoying will be shrinking. Yeah, will be shrinking, and we will have less revenue in U.S. dollars and euros. That's a definite trend in the future. We can see in the future, and this presents. Which in my mind, would present the biggest opportunity and as well as the biggest challenge to both the United States and China. That means I don't need to mention too many things, but among many factors, the most important thing is the future status of RMB, that's renminbi, the status of renminbi. I think that will be a major area. Both the United States and China would face a competing situation. We can because we will have less revenue in U.S. dollars and euros. That means China will spend more in RMB in the future, in the international trade in the future. Now we have some kind of renminbi agreements with a few countries, like the most recent is with Brazil. China credits them with billions in RMB, and then both countries can trade each other in RMB. And I just want to mention one thing. Now we know definitely this year China will be the biggest oil importer in the world. And I just raised this question. I have no answer to that. What will happen if in the future, in some 5 or 10 years, maybe in the shorter term, we will pay renminbi for the oil imports, So I don't want to say too much. I just give this a very short question. It's a question, not an answer. I don't have an answer, but this is the most important thing, as I said. Now everyone is talking about the U.S. pivot to Asia. Actually, it's a pivot to China. Some say it's an opportunity. Some say it's creating a challenging environment, strategic environment for China. I don't want to get into details for that, but I think the renminbi thing is the most important thing in the coming years, and I want to hear some comments from others. Thank you. Thank you.
First, I'd just like to thank the China-U.S. Forum for inviting me today. I'm very humbled to be on this panel with so many distinguished scholars. My first job out of undergrad actually was to be an intern at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace many years ago, when Dr. Keidel's office was right across from the office I shared, with the older people. Anything I've said since then coherently on economics is probably thanks to him. I'm not an economist, so today what I'm going to be talking about is going to be heavily security focused, and I hope you'll forgive me for that. I'm going to take some time to talk about some ideas and some theories that exist about the interaction between economics and security. And obviously, before I begin, I want to say that a war between any country in the region and with the United States is in no one's interest, and it's not inevitable. But I think, as Dr. Keidel said, there has been some stale thinking about the relationship between economics and war. And the best thing we can do is think very openly and honestly about some of the problems we're facing if we want to avoid any conflicts in the future. Dr. Green also mentioned that I have a number of affiliations with the Air Force, with CNS, and hopefully if my defense on June 13th goes well with Georgetown. And I just want to clarify, of course, that my comments are my own and don't represent any of the organizations or institutions of which I've been lucky enough to play a part.
When you're Georgetown, by the way, you won't have to say that anymore.
With the Air Force, I have to say that. Because they don't like lieutenants speaking on behalf of the organization. So since we're in an academic setting, I want to talk a little bit about political science theory. And don't worry too much. I'm just going to throw some ideas out there and think about the validity when we look at U.S.-China relationship and then China's role in the region. So there's three sort of main arguments that are made about how economic relationships lead to peace and maybe reduce the propensity for conflict between countries. There are a number of these causal links being argued in the political science literature. So one is that actually trade decreases the relative benefit of conquest, so it reduces incentives for expansionism. This is a little bit of an old school argument. It basically says, back in the day before there was trade, if you wanted to get the benefits of a productive economy, you had to go over and take them over. And now, since we engage in trade, you can benefit from comparative advantages of other countries without having to go and take them over. So we have less of an incentive for expansionism. The second, and this is one that's heard much more often in the U.S.-China relationship, is that trade dependency increases the costs of war between two states, because war will mean they'll have to forego the benefits of trade. So you'll often hear that the Chinese Communist Party, the legitimacy is based on their economic growth, and obviously severing trade ties would hurt the economy. And the severing trade ties is assumed to come in any sort of limited conflict with their neighbors, even with the United States. And therefore, it's less likely that these conflicts will happen. The third argument is that trade leads to increased interaction between people, and that when the people interact with each other, this promotes understanding and trust, and therefore they're less likely to want to go to war with one another as well. And so when you read the news, a lot of statistics that are being promoted, for example, in 2008, 300,000 Chinese visited Taiwan. Just last year, over 2.3 million visited Taiwan. These statistics are put out as part of this assumption that the more the people interact with each other, the less likely there is to be conflict between those peoples. Now, what I'm going to present to you today is the idea that economic liberalism is a myth. I personally feel that we can't rely on economics to save us. We have to think long and hard about the conflicts and issues in the region and can't trust that the increase in trade is actually going to lead to an increase in peace between countries. So the first causal link is expansionism. And I think in many cases, when you look at territorial issues in Asia, this doesn't really apply. You don't have, besides the Indian border, you don't have large parts of territory in which people are occupying it that another country might want to take over in order to seize the productivity of those people. When it comes to disputes, for example, that China has maritime disputes with some of its neighbors, that's more about historical political significance and to a certain degree natural resources. And so maybe the expansion of national interests is more of a way to think about this than sort of territorial expansion. But this doesn't really seem to be maybe where we're going to get our peace dividend from, right? That no one wants to expand beyond their borders. On the flip side, in terms of a different sort of expansionist logic, you could see the idea that economic interests could lead to more power projection capabilities. Now, this isn't sort of a perfect argument. People make it a lot of China as their economy continues to grow, military spending continues to grow. Obviously, in the reform era, military modernization was the last of the things that China looked to reform, and now it's modernizing its military naturally and organically as any country in its position would do. And it's not perfectly correlated. We see many poor countries like North Korea pouring money into their militaries, and many rich countries, many of them U.S. allies, which would spend more money on their militaries than don't. But there is this idea that you can have a more enhanced military if you have more money. But more importantly, I think when it comes to China, it's less about the power projection capabilities in that interaction with economics and more the globalization of China's interests. How economics affects security is more that China is now a global power. It has economic commercial interests all around the world. And this obviously, if China has a military to protect these interests, this isn't threatening, this is something naturally that countries do. For me, when I looked into China's interests overseas for a project I was working on, the real wild card to me seemed to be the increasing number of Chinese nationals living and traveling overseas, especially in developed nations. In 2012, over 60 million PRC citizens traveled abroad, and this is a six-fold increase since 2002. An additional 5 million citizens live abroad, and this figure is projected to reach over 100 million by 2020. Now, in interviews I did in China, in addition to this increase of nationals living abroad, there also is an increase in the expectation that the Chinese government would protect them in cases of problem or conflict. In many of the countries that Chinese nationals are operating in the developing world, they have serious security risks, and in many cases you've seen nationals be kidnapped or other things. These are problems the United States experienced, and many Chinese journals actually argue that this is what led to sort of the U.S., whatever you want to call it, sort of a global presence of the military, is the need to protect U.S. citizens working abroad and their commercial interests. So how is China going to react the first time a Chinese oil company is nationalized in Latin America, or the first time that you have a group of Chinese nationals being held hostage or even, God forbid, killed in many cases like we've seen for other countries? How is China going to react to that? And this could be something that could either, obviously, lead to greater stability in the international system, or it could lead to conflict. But I don't think the answers are very clear yet. Between 2006 and 2010, 6,000 PRC citizens were evacuated from countries in upheaval. Right? So there's obviously a connection between these commercial interests and security and military modernization. So the second argument is about trade dependency. Right? The idea if two countries trade a lot together, they're less likely to be in conflict with one another. And my hunch is that this is somewhat conditional, that trade imposes caution in peacetime, yes, and encourages leaders to think and try to de-escalate for inadvertent escalation. But I'm not very confident that this sort of puts a damper on things as much as we would hope in times of severe conflict. So the argument is often made that Chinese legitimacy is based on their exports. Now, again, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to talk about GDP because Derek would bite my head off. And I'm not going to talk about how much of the Chinese economy is export-led because Dr. Keidel has some things to say about that. So all I'm going to say is that obviously China's economic growth is somehow linked to their trade and exports with other countries. And so you can imagine in a conflict, if that was severed, that would be bad for all countries involved. Right? Many countries depend on China. But then when you see this in action, it doesn't really seem like these strong and powerful and beneficial economic relationships are imposing caution on anybody. Right? You look at the recent problems over the Senkaku Islands in September. I was just in Japan last month, and I asked most of the government officials I met with about this conflict, and I said, what was the role of business leaders in your decisions? When you look at the losses that were being accumulated, did you think about reevaluating your security policy? And the answer was obviously no. So the trade between China and Japan has tripled since 2000, and it's over $300 billion. And even with these incidents in September with the protests, we don't have obviously clear statistics about Chinese losses, but Japan has put out a number of projections of how much money has been lost, how much FDI, even though it was a temporary shock, was shifted into other countries. And yet, you don't see China or Japan seriously rethinking their policy on the Senkakus. Besides that issue, which is obviously a very sort of hot historical issue, trade between China and its neighbors in the Philippines have surged. Between Vietnam, China is Vietnam's largest trading partner. And yet, the incidents between China, Vietnam, and the Philippines have increased over the past 2 years. In the past 18 months, we've seen 10 instances what we call sort of assertive or abrasive behavior between China and the Philippines and Vietnam, right? Such as Chinese patrol boats ramming Philippine vessels, China detained a number of Vietnamese fishermen, etc. So again, as these economic relationships are growing, we don't see the spillover we're supposed to see in security. And lastly, I want to talk about the people to people. Now, this is sort of a sensitive thing to talk about, I guess, in a China-U.S. forum, probably based on the idea, and I think on the lower level, that interaction between peoples leads to greater understanding. I myself lived a year in China, and I think that seriously helped me see things from the Chinese perspective. But again, I don't think trade and increased interaction through trade has led to better perceptions of people. If you look at polls in China, in 2012, some 39% of Chinese said that they believed that Beijing's relationship with the United States was one of cooperation. And this was a drop of 70% who said so 2 years ago. 26% of Chinese said that the United States was hostile, and this had jumped 18 percentage points since 2010. And in 2012, 52% of the US public viewed China's emergence as a world power as a major threat to the United States. And in dealing with China, they listed being tough with China, mainly in economic issues, as one of the most important things that the government can do. So while there's been a general positive assessment of US-China relations, Americans are obviously concerned about the growth of the Chinese economy. And many of this is due to misunderstanding, misperceptions. 78% said the large amount of US debt held by China is a very serious problem. And anyone who knows about the debt knows that China actually holds a very minor percent of US debt, majority of foreign debt. But again, this is just to say that as the people are interacting with each other, this isn't necessarily leading to better understanding and trust. And so to conclude, I would like to say that obviously I think this is a good topic, this interaction between economics and new policy ideas. And China is unique because as it's rising, it's actually in a region that's rising as well, which is something that we've never seen before. So this is something that's very new, and I don't think we can rely on past historical studies of Germany and Great Britain during World War I to inform us on how the rise of China's economy is going to impact US-China relations and its role in the region. Economic power does not translate directly into political power. And so just as democratic peace theory, I think in US policy, when inappropriate applied, or if it's misunderstood, can actually lead to conflict and more harm than good, I think economic liberalism is something that is conditional, and it's a great idea. But then if we don't understand how trade impacts security, that by relying on economics to save us and not dealing with the tough issues between the United States and China and its neighbors, we're actually going to do more harm than good. So I know Dr. Kaidel said to bring some new ideas out there. I don't know if that level of pessimism is what he was looking for, but I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and congratulations to the people who organized this event. This is a great turnout. I see people leaving now, but I haven't even started speaking, so it can't be my fault. Normally, I would be down in front waving my hands. When I teach, I walk around and I yell and I wave hands. And when people start to fall asleep, I stand over them until they wake up. And then they never do that again because they're terrified of the crazy guy standing over them. I'm not supposed to do that now, so I'll try to keep you awake for other reasons. There's a lot of overlap here. I was asked to talk about the US-China economic competition. That sounds like it's biasing toward the negative. As an economist, competition is good. Just let me say at the beginning, there's nothing wrong with competition. As students, you all want to just get A's. Believe me, I'm quite aware of that. But you do your best work when there's some competition in the class, not when you're guaranteed a high grade. So when I talk about US-China economic competition, I'm not saying anything bad. I will say some negative things about the relationship. To echo what Oriana talked about in more detail, the competition to me seems to be fine. I'm going to organize this, I wish there was a blackboard. I could put up my little 2x3 matrix, which is the extent of my graphics ability. And actually, even the square isn't really square, but it's sort of a matrix. Macro, micro, competition, cooperation, conflict, all right? The macro level, you have competition, cooperation, and conflict between the US and China. The micro level, you have these things. So I'm going to talk about each of them. I'm not necessarily going to draw a conclusion, although I am going to issue a warning, which has something to do with my current position, which is educating the Congress, which is somewhat fruitless. So I have a little bit of a negative view of the world for that reason. The upshot here is that competition is not a problem, as I just said. There's not that much competition. There actually should be more. We benefit both. The problem here is that there's actual outright conflict that is emerging, and I argue that that's new. There was tension before, now we're getting conflict. Let's start with the macro, which is where a lot of people feel more comfortable with. I think micro is where this forum is more suitably located, so I'll close with that. The macro, unless you think the EU is a country, which I would advise against, because the country's going to shrink soon. The Sino-American trade relationship is the second largest in the world after US-Canada. And it actually should be larger. There are real problems in that relationship that it's too small, in particular that Chinese imports from the US are smaller than they should be. But everything that occurs in the relationship, and now $400 billion just in one direction a year, and over $500 billion total, it's voluntary. Everybody is choosing, nobody's putting a gun to anyone's head and saying you have to trade. So there are hundreds of billions of dollars in just trade cooperation every year. Everybody's deciding, you have something I want, I have something you want, let's make a trade. There's also investment on top of that. U.S. investment in China is considerable. China has, according to the numbers that Heritage compiles on a product I run called the China Global Investment Tracker, the U.S. has just become China's #1 target for non-bond investment. It's, of course, the #1 target for Chinese bond investment. So there are, every year, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of decisions to be made that are cooperative. Right? We're making a voluntary decision. It's better for me to do this. It's better for you to do this. That is a wonderful foundation for the relationship. The competition, the countries really don't compete that much. Oil, I guess, except the U.S. is moving off of the global oil market as China's moving on to the global oil market. So all this stuff about, they're competing over world oil resources, now China's really competing with the Japanese and the Europeans. GDP is nonsense. GDP is a statistic. It has no, yes, she gave it away. We were in Japan together. She heard me say this 15 different times. I could have made fun of your Japan presentations. GDP is a summary statistic. It doesn't cause anything. You'll see politicians saying, well, we had not enough job creation in March because of low GDP growth. That doesn't make any sense, right? The analogy I use is when I step on a scale, I don't blame it for my weight gain, right? Oh, my scale is making me fat. No. My eating habits are making me fat. My scale is what says I'm fat. Right? So GDP is not a useful thing. The idea that the U.S. and China are in some contest to see who has the biggest GDP and the GDP measures the economy is just false and silly. There are people who talk about it, fine, but it's not real competition, it's fake competition. Do they produce similar things and battle over global market share? No, they don't produce similar things. China is trying to move up the value chain. It's a long process. I think it'll happen. It's already started to happen. But they still mostly make stuff and the U.S. designs things. They don't compete. Right? There's starting to be competition in finance, which I think is really interesting. It's basically, the big five now, state banks and China Development Bank against, a whole array of U.S. banks. But it's pretty limited. I mean, that could be a source of future tension. But really, there's not that much competition. We hear a lot of talk about it. It's pretty misplaced. Even the trade bloc competition, which we're starting to see now with RCEP, which is a Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an ASEAN-based initiative, but is seen by some people as China's trade group, and then TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was not started by the U.S. but is nonetheless seen as the U.S.'s trade group. Those two could actually help each other. A little healthy competition would be good. Maybe we'd get better and faster agreements, and with one eye on each other, maybe we'd get less political nonsense. I doubt it, given the countries involved on all sides, but one can hope. So I don't think that even the RCEP and TPP competition is bad. Competition is not bad. It can lead to other things that are difficult. And the trade bloc competition could degenerate into real, solid, conflicting blocs, and that's a danger. And that gets me to the conflict side of this. And the conflict side of this, there are a lot of things to talk about. I don't have that much time, and you've already heard two speakers, and there's another one after me. I don't want to go on and on and on about many, many things that we could talk about. I'm just going to pick one thing because it's topical now. It's topical both in terms of events and in terms of policy, which is the side I work on, which is cyber. You have had a Chinese state-led campaign of theft on the econ side. There's actually, on the security side, cyber in all directions. But on the U.S.-China relationship, we're excluding France here, which also likes to have the state-run cyber theft campaigns. On the U.S.-China relationship, there is no corresponding U.S. state-led campaign of econ theft. So we're having a rather one-sided conflict. The good thing about a one-sided conflict is it remains contained. The bad thing is it's not going to stay one-sided. The U.S. is absolutely heading towards national retaliation that will be compelled by the Congress unless there's improvement. So I'm giving, that's part one of the warning. That's the macro warning. Competition is not a problem. There's a lot of whining in the United States about competition. Too bad. Competition is good for countries. It's good for people. There's a lot of cooperation. But we're now seeing probably the sharpest economic conflict in the relationship in some time starting to emerge. And it could get worse. Now I'm going to talk about the micro side. So that's half. That's the macro side. That's the big picture. That's what you give speeches about. The micro side is this room. And this room has the positives and the negatives. There are literally millions of decisions, economic and otherwise, to buy goods, services, and information, to hire people, to share supply chains, to create joint ventures that are made every day. Consumer electronics are designed in the U.S., they're assembled in China, they're sold in both countries. Sinopec has helped fund U.S. shale gas expansion, which is going to indirectly benefit China even if none of the shale gas is sold to China because it will affect the world market. U.S. local officials go to Beijing and they look for investment. There are Chinese students in the U.S. There might be one or two in this audience. There was an interesting article a couple days ago about Chinese students really being interested in accounting, which is a big problem in the U.S.-China relationship now. So it's great that there are Chinese students here who want to study accounting. That will really help. So we have lots of really, really important cooperative aspects, and this even includes sensitive things. You know, we talk about quality control in the U.S. and we get upset about some quality control failures in China that affect us, but Chinese ingredients supply a lot of U.S. advanced pharmaceuticals. Right? That's a pretty sensitive issue. U.S. soybeans are very important in the Chinese food supply. That's a very sensitive issue. So we have cooperative relationships that extend, that not only are intense and dramatic, they extend to very sensitive things. So there is, at the micro level, a cooperation story that occurs every day that is very important. And this is a little tiny part of it right here in this forum. Competition, the main story that gets told in the U.S. is that Chinese workers are pushing American workers out of traditional industry jobs. So this worker is hurting me. I'm an American worker, a Chinese worker is hurting me. Actually, this happened before the move of Asian production to China. The American workers were pushed out of jobs by Japan, and then the Asian tigers, and Mexico, and a process of globalization. When those jobs leave China, and they're going to, when those jobs leave China, they won't come back to the U.S. Somebody else will then be displacing American workers. Right? Globalization does that. We're going to get, within 5 years probably, certainly 10, Chinese workers complaining that Indians and Bangladeshis and Indonesians are taking their jobs. Okay, that's competition. Sometimes, you know, there are people who win competitions and people who lose. And maybe even losing the competition doesn't exactly mean what you think, because you could move on to a better job. That's the idea. The American complaints about competition are misdirected, largely, not entirely. There is a competitive element where U.S. firms are not allowed to compete freely in China because of the prerogatives of the state. Right? There are a number of important sectors where state firms cannot fail, and even some where they can't shrink. It's hard to compete in that environment. That's not a fair competitive environment. You can maybe make some money, but you can't compete fairly, right? Because one side can't lose. Not really a good competition. Competition I'd like to be part of if I was the side that can't lose. Not so fun for everybody else. So there's some problems in the competition on the firm and the worker level. I think they're exaggerated. Let's get to the conflict. And again, I'm picking out one element of conflict because it's the most salient now, and we don't have that much time. And it generalizes. It's IPR theft. And here's where I'm going to say something that is unpleasant. So be ready. Firms hurt firms in IPR theft. And the biggest backer of the U.S.-China relationship has consistently been the business community. When Chinese firms attack American firms with their IPR, they're undermining the relationship. It's the macro side the micro side undermining the macro side. We don't have to talk about what justified, exaggerated, what the extent of this is. People throw out trillions of dollars. It's very hard to measure, I think. So when you casually use trillions of dollars, you're on unsafe ground. The point is every action weakens the relationship because it's the business community that really has protected the U.S.-China relationship from criticism. So the macro action from firm against firm has been negative. Now here's the part that people aren't going to like. I work at the Heritage Foundation. I'm wearing black. I'm the voice of doom in a lot of respects. All right? Everybody is involved. There are all different kinds of people involved in IPR theft. But if you look, and I have, at more than 30 cases, because you know 30 is the magic number, above 30, everything is a large number, below 30, everything is a small number. That's actually not true, but that's what they tell you in intro statistics class, so just go with it for a while. When you get to a large number of cases, the overwhelming number of people who are convicted of IPR theft in this country are ethnic Chinese. Why? Because I might have the interest and ability to steal IPR from a firm, but I can't as easily make money up from it in China. Because I'm not Chinese, and I don't know all these people, and I can't easily set up a business. So there's an incentive set up for ethnic Chinese to steal IPR from American firms. We are right now representing a positive micro element, person to person. except for me offending everyone in the audience. But before that, we were representing something positive person to person. There are also negative person to person things. The FBI comes into my office all the time and says, this guy that you just met is bribing people. Okay? I don't know if that's true, but I bet some of it's true. This echoes, not that Oriana wants to be associated with my comments at all, but she's next to me, so she's stuck. This echoes what she just said. The micro side we think of as positive because we all have, good intentions in our hearts, and we're at an event that's positive. It's also negative. That negative side has come to fore more recently, and that's a factor in our relationship as well. Now, I'll give you a punchline. Competition is the lifeblood of prosperity. There are going to be complaints about competition. There are complaints about what the U.S. does to China, what China does to the U.S. There will always be complaints. Bert mentioned before that these get politicized. They do, and they get louder during transition or election years. That's not the problem. Despite American complaining, competition is good for everyone. There's some subversion of competition on the Chinese side that I don't like, but that's not really the big issue. The big issue is emergent conflict. Let's take a world where we actually move towards trade blocs. And let's overlay that world, really what is now, on the econ side, not on the security side, one-sided cyber theft by China. That is a much scarier world than currency legislation world. Currency legislation world where the U.S. Congress complains about currency and then they pass legislation and it never goes forward. That's kind of old hat, stale, as somebody was saying earlier. That's not what we should worry about. People will talk about it, but as you who are going to follow U.S.-China relations probably for a long time, you'll see that come and go, and it's boring. What isn't boring is when there are macro, like trade blocs, and micro, like cyber theft conditions coming together that encourage actual conflict. So that's the warning I'm going to end with. I work a block away from the Congress. They're not happy, and maybe they're unjustified in some of their unhappiness, but reality is they're not happy.
Thank you. Before anyone takes offense, I don't think anyone will, at the comment on cyber, let me just weigh in and say I agree with what Derek said, and it, I think, is the biggest threat to U.S.-China relations in some ways right now. It's not just firms. It's NGO groups, civil society, it's think tanks. People don't talk about it much, but I'll tell you candidly, if you work on China, if you work particularly on China's security, you have many unwelcome visitors in cyberspace, and it's well known and well understood where it comes from. And in particular for civil society groups, which should be like business community, NGOs and so forth, important constituents in the relationship, it's affecting the tone. So it's tough, and unlike trading blocks, nuclear weapons, we don't know how to do it. This is an aspect of international relations that's new. And governments don't know how to regulate or talk about or reach confidence building measures on. So it's one of these wild cards in U.S.-China relations. It's in some ways a micro issue, as you're saying, but something we're thinking about. Okay, finally, Lan, thank you.
So first of all, let me thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm not coming from an economist background, and I was just working for an industry investment bank, and I was in equity research. And in year 2009, when CICC, China International Capital Corporation, decided to set up their U.S. subsidiary, I was relocated from Beijing after spending 10 years with the company. So what I would like to do today here is try to answer some of the tough questions that Dr. Kaido just raised. And I think those are really good questions, and sometimes I've seen a drastic contrast in views in the world. So I would like to share my thoughts on some of those questions. First of all, is the Chinese economy. You know, when I was joining the investment banking industry as an equity research analyst, I started to see very volatile views on Chinese economy, sometimes very two extreme views on the spectrum. And the surprising outcome is that over the years, I've been working with U.S. investors who are extremely bullish on China for the last decade. I've also been working with clients that have been extremely bearish on China. But surprisingly, both camps were able to make money on China. So it's actually not so about the extreme views. It's actually about how you can manage your risk throughout the process. So China was never as bad as people think it was going to collapse. And it was also never as good as people thought that it will be able to sustain 12 or 11% growth going forward. So over the years, I think my experience shows that when you look at China, two things are very important when you evaluate where China is. I think inflation. China is easy to generate growth because we only have close to 4,000 GDP per capita. And if anybody was telling me in this room that China is going to stall its growth at this point of time, and I don't think that's going to happen. Back in 1989, I was a student on the street, and back then, everybody felt that it was the darkest period of time and China is going to collapse. And look what happened 2 years after that. China became an even more open country. And since then, it was actually the most blossom period of time of the China economic growth. Of course, we had a period of time that inflation was going up in 20 or 30% in the early 90s when I was working for General Electric in their Shanghai office. But over the time, if you gave China a little bit of a dynamic view on China rather than a static view on China, then you would easily generate China is going to change. It's not going to look like what it is right now. So that's the reason that I'm actually more positive on the ultimate outlook of China, because if you look at the consumption growth, there are just so many areas that I'm going to see China has a drastic demand that cannot be satisfied by its existing supply. And if we can go ahead with the right reform that we have been seeing earlier, in the late 90s and early 2000s, I think the country can go ahead with its growth. And I totally agree. GDP growth doesn't mean anything because China can 12%, but what does it mean? What's the quality? Does it mean that the same kind of a growth would imply a long-term ROE return on equity that would be sustainable? If it is not, then it's not quality growth. China doesn't need that. So when going back to the consumption growth, and I'm pretty sure that a lot of you who have been to China, if you have been going into any of the public hospitals, you will understand immediately there is a strong demand. We have a supply issue, and if we can change the system, we can allow more efficiency built into that system, the privatization of that sector, there will be dramatic growth. I joined the industry as a telecom analyst, and that was the beginning of China privatized, we would quote unquote, not the privatization that you're talking in this part of the world, but incorporatize that sector and bring it to a public company in Hong Kong. And that was the time we reformed that sector a decade ago, and nobody back then believed that China would be able to develop its own telecom industry without a major support from the overseas capital to become the largest telecom market in the world. And a decade from there, now we have the largest subscriber base, the most profitable telecom operators, and all of them become public traded companies in Hong Kong. So if we are going through that type of structural change, separate the administration, the regulator from the operational side, and the efficiency of that sector will improve, and that will give us the reform dividend, as we have been seeing in other industries, for example, like banking, for example, like insurance sector. So those sectors need that type of reform, for example, healthcare, for example, entertainment, where we see CCTV at almost quasi-monopoly in that sector, which again, I totally agree that competition is the best thing you can have. You can bring more productivity, you can encourage the demand, and you can bring in the growth. So other sectors like education, a lot of the students here that have been studying in China probably before, you know that most of the kids in China were going through the public education system, and we can encourage, and it's great, but also we need a variety. You know, all of these need the confidence of the government to believe that, you know, having less control on a certain sector that actually will improve the efficiency going forward. And I think a lot of that have been widely discussed in China. Because of the political change, people very recently, investors were a little disappointed because they haven't seen the kind of reform quickly happen immediately. But you know, given a little bit of time, given what we have seen in the past, that's likely to happen. Is that going to happen on a willing, voluntary basis by the interest group? It's not. It may probably down the road take a couple of hiccups before people realize they have to make the changes, but eventually it will happen. I think the fundamental difference for China's economic growth between now and 30 years before is that there were a period of time during the Cultural Revolution. The target of the people, or the meaningfulness of the people's life, was not to get a better life. You know, there were more ideology debate back then. But if you look at China today, I think there is only one single target for ordinary people, for the government. It was to improve people's living standard. And if that's the single target, I just don't see why they wouldn't go ahead either voluntarily or involuntarily to make those changes. So I'm hopeful, but depend on how you can control your risk. Remember to when you're doing the investment over there. So secondly, that I'd like to answer was actually about the reform. What are the areas we're going to see more reform? I mentioned a little bit of reform on the state-owned sectors, or some of the sectors that are still under the control of all the major dominance from the government at this stage. But there are also one thing that I think will likely to dramatically change the mobility and also people's life. It is the hukou system. I think that has been voiced out for a very long time. I remember when I started my first job, that was in 1991, that was right after the Tiananmen Square incident. It was pretty difficult to get a job. One priority at the time for me was to get a Beijing hukou. So I will work for any company who can get me Beijing hukou, and I will have to sign a contract to work for that firm for 5 or 6 years just to keep my Beijing hukou. And that's the type of thing that you actually discourage, you know, the creativity and also the innovation and the mobility of people. But over the time, you don't see people now are working to stay in one company just because they want to keep a hukou, and that's the drastic change. But we still need more for not just the graduate students, but also for people from the very grassroots, for example, the rural areas, that they will have the similar kind of a mobility. You know, because of the social safety net, as Dr. Kaito just mentioned, that we were not able to provide that kind of a freedom. But once we can, and that will be a big impact on the economic growth and the drivers, and also giving people the hope that they can improve their life. I think for the Chinese government, there is only one thing they need to remember that is going to be very different, very important for the country, is that giving people the hope that they can climb the social ladder, they can improve their living standard. You know, some of the corruption, some of the system problems that we're seeing right now, is that going to make people feel that they lost the hope and they no longer want to work as hard as in the past? So far, I'm still very positive. I think for generations,
if you look at the last century, 100 years, China was not, a lot of the Chinese were not able to get the opportunity to work for themselves, to improve their life standards, and now they're given. Although there are a little change that, when you get into the one-child generation, they may not work as hard as their parents, but still people will treasure the opportunities, and that's the fundamental, I think, driver for the economic growth in China. And last, I'd like to touch upon my observation of the Sino-China relationship, Sino-U.S. relationship, because I'm not an expert in international relationship. I'm just through my observations by working in China for many years and studying in this country, and also working in this country for some time and working for one of the greatest companies in U.S., General Electric, in the past. I think there are opportunities that people need to work together to try to understand each other much better. I think one thing that I'm learning and I continue need to learn, and I think a lot of Chinese need to learn, is the American exceptionalism. I don't know whether that's a very sensitive topic or not, because when I was in China, I never heard of that, I never knew it, and I just started to get used to it and learn it. I don't think China has a problem with it, but I think it's just the Chinese culture in the past, because they are very zhongyong. They're trying to take a moderate approach in most of the cases. You're just not used to for somebody take very granted for its own exceptionalism, and they need to learn how they are. They can operate in a mechanism and that situation. And I think Dr. Kissinger, who spoke at a CICC forum about 3 years ago, he mentioned something I think it was very intriguing. He says the Americans, actually, given the much shorter history, probably they have never experienced a period of time that they were not rising, they were not the most important force in the world for the last over 200 years. But if they stretched the history much longer, they probably will start to realize that, for much longer time of the history, that China was actually the very important force of the world. And the Chinese, given what they have experienced in the last 10 years, they have been gone through humiliation, they have been being in a very oppressing situation, and they just start to feel a little bit better about themselves because of the growth of the living standard, and they need to manage not to, go out of, not try to be too much showy in that case. And that wasn't the exact words, but that's my understanding. So I think that both countries are very competitive. When I saw how people are disappointed with the Georgetown basketball team, and I think, this is a country I need to learn. Oh, by the way, my son is 11, and he was crazy about that game. He predicted Georgetown to be in the final too. So, but anyway, so both countries need to learn how they can position themselves in the future competition.